Hello and welcome to the Penny D podcast. This is for you if you would like to sit for 20 to 30 minutes every month, relaxing your mind and just listening to my ramblings about life, love, happiness and much more. I'm your host, Penny Davis, and welcome to the show. Welcome to the show, Claire.
It's great to be with you, Penny. Thanks.
Claire, tell me about your journey from radical politics to the House of Lords.
There was a gap in between, but I think that I was always involved in radical left-wing politics for many years. But I was also a further education lecturer, and I was involved in, I did some journalism. I was often on Radio 4 because I wrote on education and so on. And how I ended up in the House of Lords was the infamous Brexit vote, which is that I stood as a Brexit Party MEP, got elected for the Northwest. And the thing that was interesting about that was that I had never had any interest in being a parliamentarian. I only did it as a one-off thing. I fully anticipated I'd finish being an MEP and go back to running the Academy of Ideas. And the Academy of Ideas is about creating a public space for debate and discussion, and fits in very much with my commitment to free speech. It also fits in with my former job as a further education lecturer, because I saw it as a kind of public education project in a way, making sure that political discussion was not just confined to the elites, but was open to everyone. And that's what the aim of what all of our projects at the Academy of Ideas. And then right at the end of being an MEP, I got this phone call, which I assumed was a joke, saying it's number 10 here, and so on and so forth. And I did think it was a joke, and I set up, I thought it was a radio program setting me up, and it wasn't. And they offered me a peerage. Just to know, I've always said that the House of Lords should be abolished. And the conversation started with the person who phoned me, I don't know who it was, saying, we know that you think the House of Lords should be abolished. We don't care. We know you're going to say no, but listen anyway. And then they went on. And then I had to decide. And I didn't decide straight away. I just thought, this is mad. I'm not going to do it, but I did it. And so I saw it as a platform, see it as a platform through which maybe issues that wouldn't be raised, I can raise. I'm not affiliated to any party. I haven't got the party whip. I'm independent. And so I try and speak in the House of Lords as I find, and not be too intimidated by the fact that I'm now in those hallowed chambers of the elite. And one thing I did in this sort of rather pathetic attempt at saying that I'd be democratic was I said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put every speech that I make up on social media so that at least people can see what happens in the House of Lords. And this was quite unusual at the time. But actually, the House of Lords online team rather liked it. They were delighted because they were trying to get people to do it. And now actually loads of people in the House of Lords do it. And I think it's good, because when I arrived, it felt as though there was, unlike the Commons, it felt as though people in the Lords talked to each other, but they had no concept that anyone outside was listening. So it really was like a club. And I thought, I can't do this. So I would always approach it as a more public-facing affair. And now that's what I do. I do it every fortnight. I do it inside the Lords, which is a kind of behind-the-scenes, gossipy, what's happened in the last few weeks, attempt to getting to grips with politics in a more informal way. So that's the journey.
That is absolutely fascinating. And I would say that with the Lords, it comes up still about the Lords. And it's only since I've seen your debates that I really understand why we need the Lords, that there is a place for it actually, because there is a different perspective that comes in.
Well, I don't want to be the excuse for keeping them on, because I do think that overall we can say it's undemocratic because we're unelected. And you could say, what the hell am I doing there? And what the hell am I doing there? And by the way, what the hell I'm doing there is undoubtedly because Boris Johnson's team, rather than him, I'm sure he wouldn't know me, who fell over me, at the time, they had a worry because they'd got the election in 2019. But of course, they very much had the votes of red wool areas on loan. And I think they were trying to acknowledge. So there was three of us, I think, that you could say did that, which was Gisela Stewart, who was a Labour Brexiteer, Kate Hoey, Labour Brexiteer, and me, a Brexit Party, but lefty Brexiteer. And they thought, oh, it's a nod to the red wall to give them three peerages. And we do try, certainly Kate Hoey and I are a bit like on the back bench, naughty seats. You know what I mean? We're argumentative backbenchers who are beholden to no one. And so I hope that we provide a service, but I don't think the House of Lords is fit for purpose. But whilst it's there, you might as well try and use it.
Absolutely. And I admire you for going forward with it on that basis, because you can't make change sometimes from the outside, can you? Yeah, I enjoyed it. And talking about our institutions, education, if you look at the Battle of Ideas, I've been to those events and I'm really looking forward to London this year. Why have we lost faith in our institutions, in our universities, and in politics, do you think?
Well, I mean, actually, oh God, we've been doing the Academy of Ideas, which the organisation. We set that up in the kind of Blairite era, just a bloody long time ago now, 25 years ago. And one of the things initially was that, you remember, Blair came in. This is not even a political point; it's just an observation. Very much on the basis that we were style, not substance. So we had a kind of era of spin doctors, and we were saying, yeah, the problem with that is that you don't ever get a chance to talk about things because we've just been presented with this sort of rather slick presentation of managerial politics rather than ordinary people having their say. So that's where it started, but fairly quickly, the free speech wars that we're more familiar with started to really take a grip. And the Battle of Ideas Festival slogan is free speech allowed, with ALLOWED, but allowed as in speaking. And I mean, to state the obvious, but to just make that clear, it was just a bit of a slogan. We didn't really think about it, but suddenly became this like revolutionary slogan, right? Oh, you encourage free speech. And the reason for that was because it had become fashionable to say the phrase, I find that offensive. And that was meant to then shut you up. They weren't saying, I find that offensive and let's have a chat about it. It was like, I find that offensive. And if you carried on, they'd then try and get you cancelled. And we didn't have the concept of cancel culture by name at that stage, but it became increasingly difficult with an atmosphere of you can't say that. You just can't say that. And I think that politics got infected by that. It was a loss of confidence, by the way. I think politicians lost confidence in ordinary people. It was almost as though they believed that ordinary, and I keep saying ordinary people, working people, the vast majority, if you let them have free reign, that they were bound to say something atrocious. So they started trying to manage what you said. And it was stifling. It still is stifling. And increasingly more and more institutions bought into this as a way of managing their workforce. Sounds cynical, even a bit conspiratorial, but nowadays, if the boss wants to shut up some annoying, loud mouth who's maybe complaining about conditions at work, you're more likely to be done under the equality, diversity and inclusion rules than you are over the fact that you've been complaining that the tea break's been cut. But they use this progressive sounding language to really neuter people, silence them in many ways. And the whole attack on workplace banter, even the watch what you say, be careful you don't upset, so on and so forth, I think has been really divisive because it's set people against each other. And so going to work is not a pleasant experience for a lot of people now, because the only thing that made work for a lot of people was not just that you got your wages, but it was the camaraderie, often camaraderie against the boss, or moaning about the customers if you worked in retail, or because everybody's got something that makes you just whinge a bit. That's like part of workplace. You can't do that anymore, because these days you're likely to find yourself dragged before HR and reprimanded for being, as you say, offensive, or for attacking somebody because of their identity, even though you never even thought about that. But if you criticize somebody who's got a protected characteristic, then they think you're doing it for that reason. God, I never even noticed that. That's not what I was thinking at all. But that atmosphere then, I think, means that people really do feel that there are a lack of spaces where you can just be frank and open. And the final thing I say on this is, I really think the ability to think aloud is crucial in society. We have to experiment. You want to be able to say, well, I think it's bloody hell, it's so bad. You don't really mean, but you're trying out. What do you think about this? This is terrible. I think we should do this. That's how and what then happens is your mates go, don't be daft. That's a ridiculous idea. And you have a discussion, an argument, and you work through ideas, through getting what you think out into the open. That's often what has happened over the years. Now, if you are so frightened that what you say might be used against you and that there's a kind of Stasi-like atmosphere and that some snitch will say, oh, do you know what they said in the tea break? And then you might get fired for it, or you might get into trouble or called a bigot or something. You don't speak. And as a consequence, people are just like muffled. And I think that means that we can't move forward, because you can't ever be corrected by your peers. You need to be able to say things, even if that people say, don't be daft. But somehow it just festers inside. It's very unhealthy. So the Battle of Ideas Festival and all the activities that the Academy of Ideas run is to give people an opportunity to think aloud and not have to come up with the end product in a polished speech, but to just say, what about this? What about that? And we cope with that.
I think something you said, pick up on earlier, about it was dressed up as this very progressive language, which I think a lot of us bought into. And what I find the most disturbing about that, I didn't even really realise it was going on in the Blair years. I only noticed this in the past 5 years or so. And it was only when we saw it, you can't unsee it. And the thing about offence as well, I always remember Ricky Gervais saying, just because you're offended, it doesn't mean you're right. And we have to be allowed to offend each other to understand why we feel uncomfortable with something. And it seems to be going the wrong way again, Claire. So blasphemy laws seem to be at the fringes, and someone was just, I think, arrested for burning a Quran. There's been some really disturbing incidences recently where there's a big overreach again. Do you think that there is any hope we can pull this back in this government?
I don't really rest much faith in the government as yet, because they haven't shown any instincts for acknowledging that free speech is an important democratic value, and the opposite. And they don't even realize what they're doing. Like, for example, they don't seem to understand that any official definition of Islamophobia given as guidance to institutions is inevitably going to have a chilling impact. And this is the point about having open discussion. There is undoubtedly a problem that some people, anybody who's a Muslim, as problematic. And that's like awful, abhorrent. You shouldn't do that. That's like ridiculous.
Yeah.
But we can't be in a situation where if you criticize someone who is a Muslim, that you can be accused of Islamophobia. And we know the consequences. Think of the Manchester Arena bombing. I've just sat through hours and hours and hours of legislation about protecting buildings from terrorism, inspired by the Manchester Arena bombing and known as Martin's Law. And I kick back about a lot of the proposed legislation, because it's going to have a massive impact on smaller venues who now have to go through regulatory chaos in order to prove that they've done some pre-terrorism. This is like the village hall, right? It's like, and it felt to me completely performative, waste of time. But the thing that we do know about what happened in relation to the building security in Manchester was that, in fact, it wasn't that the security guards hadn't been sent on a training scheme. The security guard who noticed a suspicious-looking lad with a massive rucksack muttering to himself and looking out of place and looking very uncomfortable was frightened to make the approach, because he didn't want to be accused of being a racist in any way or being Islamophobic. So he didn't approach the person who ended up killing 22 people. So in a way, that's something, a cultural issue that needs to be tackled. And without going into it, we know that one of the most disturbing aspects of the grooming gangs scandal is that so many good, well-intentioned people who were social workers, teachers, knew things were happening. They were told, they knew exactly, but
Yeah.
they were very anxious about intervening because they didn't want people to think they were bigot. Because I think one of the most effective ways of silencing you is saying that you'll get the label bigot. And it doesn't matter whether I'm from the left, I'm from an anti-racist tradition. Women's rights all my life. I fought against the fash in the day. I was involved in an organization called Workers Against Racism. We did street patrols in the Midlands where I was living at the time. And there were people firebombing Asian families' homes, right? So I'm from that tradition.
Yeah.
And we fought very hard. And I was in Coventry. I knew the specials, fought very hard for a kind of black and white unite and fight approach to this stuff. So there's nothing more insulting to me than to be called a racist, right? I hate it. It really makes my skin crawl. And you're scared of that. You don't want that. And you don't want people that you know and respect to think that you are a racist, right? So you kind of balk. But of course, the impact of that is that you don't speak out.
Yeah.
And the problem with that is that we are in danger of doing that on about 10 different issues. So when you ask about the government, the problem is the government, I'm afraid, keep introducing things which I think will undermine our confidence in speaking out. And I think that's very bad for free speech. The positive side is I wrote a book less than 10 years ago-ish called I Find That Offensive. And it then got republished as I Still Find That Offensive, which the publishers thought was funny. And when I wrote it, it was about Generation Snowflake and addressed to young people who were particularly involved in stopping free speech, using anti-racism, using the fight for the oppressed and the vulnerable as their kind of Trojan horse. And that they really thought they were doing the right thing in an identity politics way. Anyway, I thought I was going to get absolutely hammered by those young people, but a lot more young people liked the book than the educational establishment who hated it. And then there's the social services that took against it because I criticised safetyism and over preoccupation with safeguarding in terms of like kids playing outside and that sort of thing. So so what I've realised is that actually each generation, despite the fact we've got a generation snowflake a little bit, I've seen more and more young people starting to kick back. They themselves realize that they're being silenced, that they're not being given a fair shot, that they're not allowed at university to openly question things in seminars. They can't even say, I want to read this because somebody will say you shouldn't read that. That is a pro-colonialist tract. And do you know that the author was sympathetic to slavery? And so some of the great classics are being demonized, et cetera, et cetera. So I feel as though there's a much greater public awareness. And you just said yourself about yourself. In the last 5 years, I think the public have become quite astute now. And if anything, it's gone the other way, which is somebody calls you a racist and you go, well, gives it anyone's far right racist. It annoys me a bit because there are people who are racist and far right. And I want to be able to say that without everyone going, everyone is. But on the other hand, it means that the bigot label is not silencing people as much because people know they're not bigots and they are therefore prepared to be a bit braver.
Yes, and I think you've nailed it there. The generation I'm from, Gen X, we were told to be colourblind, everything, the opposite of identity politics. So a lot of those labels that you said, like you, I often fought against homophobia, racism, really outspoken, really had my time with it. And for me to be called anything like that, I find it so hurtful. But not anymore, like you said, because I almost take it as a badge of honor that I am not seeing any people other than what their behavior is. And that's the difficulty, isn't it, with the laws that are trying to bring through and how people are being conditioned to speak. Actually, it's the opposite of racism to call somebody out for their behavior because you're just observing their behavior and not what they Oh, and I hate that label as well. And talking about cancellation, he said we didn't have a name for it before, and we do now. We see it now. And I've noticed, and I've written myself about the witch trials previously, and noticed that women always come under more fire. And I've noticed this more because I've been involved in some of the women's rights, and particularly with the erosion of women's rights at the moment, much to what you've spoken about there, Claire, where it's got to the point where women can't say they are uncomfortable with their boundaries, perhaps being breached in their private places, that they change rooms, toilets, whatever it is, because I always say we don't have to explain why we don't want to drop our boundaries. Do you think women do get a harder time over is it easier to silence women than men, let's say?
I think one of the great fights of our contemporary time has been the need to reassert the basis of women's equality and women's freedom. It's hard to imagine in 2025 that you'd be forced to say that. But I think exactly in the way that you described, a lot of us were taken aback because we come from a progressive tradition and started off being lesbian and gay rights and opposing Section 28 and hating homophobia and fighting for gay equality and going on pride marches. So as it gradually went LGBT and then LGBT and then LGBTQ, like you just went along with it. But I hate that expression, Bane, but you just say it, don't you? You just always at the latest without really understanding that there was an assault going on, that there was an adding to lesbian and gay rights of category of people who were going to be used, not they themselves, but be used, that is trans people, were going to be used as a battering ram around women's rights. And so we got into the trans gender ideology versus women's rights row. And the reason why it was shocking was because we started to be called transphobic for the most basic things. I remember when originally Professor Kathleen Stock, she and I were both asked to write short articles in The Economist. The Economist were having some big event on, and they had a special, and I was quite shocked, Economist, like all very establishment and all that. So I kind of wrote my essay. Mine was called Illiberal Liberalism. And it was about the rise of, now I didn't have by the way, the trans issue was only it was all the things we're talking about. Kathleen Stock I'd never heard of, was a philosophy professor at University of Sussex. Nobody'd heard of her. No disrespect, but she wasn't famous. We were well known enough to get asked to write Economist essays, but we weren't exactly household names. She wrote hers, and the next minute, everyone was saying this woman is transphobic. And then the Economist then came under a huge amount of pressure. Now, there's a funny bit to this. The editor of the section in The Economist who'd commissioned me said that he thought that my liberalism article was a caricature and that probably I was exaggerating and so on. He said that, right? He said, very well written piece, really like it, but I don't recognize it. I was thinking you wouldn't. After a couple of weeks of having published Kathleen Stock, when suddenly The Economist became hate enemy number one, and they suddenly got surrounded by all these people saying The Economist was transphobic for publishing Kathleen Stock, this kind of not that well known, right? He then talked to me, and it was really funny, and he said to me, oh, it looks like I underestimated it, and you might well have been spot on. And if anything, you might have underestimated the problem. So I think that a lot of people didn't even know there was a problem. And I'm saying that because you suddenly realize, oh my God, they're even going to go for well-known lesbian scholars are going to be called bigots. And the reason why and all she'd done was, it really was a very moderate account of the distinction between sex and gender in terms of the gender wars. And this is, I don't know when it was, 10 years ago or something. And so I draw your attention to that because it gradually dawned on you. I wrote a column for an educational publication. They're always nagging me to write things because I'm not a great writer, and I'd said, oh, I do think so. They kept nagging me. I wrote for their online section. I did write, and they'd be saying, Claire, write another column. They always go down really well. And I wrote a column on whether I thought it was wrong that there was trans activists being invited into schools. And the funny bit about this was, my argument was that there was been a big controversy where a trans activist was invited into school and told the pupils that they should decide who they were going to be and that they had the right to say no to a teacher. And I said, as a former teacher, this is a nightmare. The last thing you need are external speakers saying, I'm the one that can't. We go down that route, every 16-year-old is going to run riot. So I made this point. In other words, I wasn't really doing the trans issue. That was just the example because it had been in the national papers. I'm writing it up. Suddenly, the educational publication that had begged me back for ages didn't ask me again and said there'd been a lot of trouble. That article suddenly wasn't online. Now, again, it wasn't an official cancellation. It was a kind of, and I thought, what? And then I realized that there's something about this particular subject that means, now to get back to your question, obviously women noticed before many men that their taken for granted rights of things which none of us thought that we would be having arguments about sharing toilets or changing rooms, because this seems like a trivial, minor part of our lives. It's not something we think about. We take it for granted that we have that space. Started to be a subject of invasion. I mean, I can't explain it anyway. I thought, my God, what? And of course, when it became political around rape crisis centres, domestic abuse, I don't know about you, because I was one of those people who fought long and hard for domestic abuse facilities in the past, to reclaim the streets, and then on the one hand, and then also in terms of our capacity to have facilities for women who were being attacked physically at home. And suddenly, again, the big thing we always did was they had to be secret places where hardly anyone knew where you were. I got a couple of people into facilities and then I wouldn't even know where they were. It was all cloak and dagger, wasn't it? So the next thing, we were advertising and saying that a woman, or if you identify as a woman. So this is, women, I think, were the first in the front line of calling this out. What a shock it was to discover that because you were a woman, entering into a debate which was being defined by people who identified as women but weren't women, that and their allies, that somehow being a woman expressing the concerns of women you were a witch. And it was a shocker. And it carries on. It's got marginally better, but it does carry on. And I think that in that sense, something about the way women have been treated in this debate makes you realize that potentially the great gains of women's liberation were a little bit more superficial than we'd thought, because underneath the surface is an awful lot of people prepared to throw you under the bus very quickly.
Yes. Yeah. Like you say, we never, ever imagined we would have to explain why we didn't want men in rape crisis centres, refuges, even leisure centre changing facilities, and having to justify that is a real shock, isn't it? And when other women are attacking you for standing up for women, it's the most bizarre situation you find yourself in. I think it is getting a little bit better for the reasons we've spoken about. People are becoming more aware of that. But you see it time and time again. When a woman stands up and says something, they get mobbed. And I think we see more, like you say, that slow cancellation that is a feeling you don't get asked again. Perhaps men aren't as sensitive to initially. But
they sort of go, I don't know what your problem is with the toilet. And you think, we know, because you're men and you've never understood things like that. But I think at the moment, there's two cases of nurses, the Darlington nurses, who, nurses have to get changed all the time. It's the nature of the job. And the next minute, there's somebody using the changing facilities where they're just like stripping off and not thinking, which women do with other women, but you definitely do not do with men. And as you say, it's like irritating when somebody says, "What's your problem?" It's like, oh,
Yeah.
yeah, when you
don't
really
have
want, why do I have to tell you why it's a problem? It's just different. But anyway, and then somebody identifying as a woman, but a male person was using their changing rooms, and they objected and tried to do something, and they were treated like the criminals. So that was a problem, and there's a problem in Scotland. Now, what's changed is there's no problem with a nurse in Scotland, is that they're involved in employment tribunals, and we know about them. There's press coverage. There's at least some sympathy. They were dobbed in by their trade unions, by the way, which is a great distress to me that the trade unions didn't support them. The Darlington nurses have actually been in a situation where they have set up their own trade union, the Darlington Nurses Union, and they're inviting health workers everywhere who are interested or concerned about this. There's also another nurse who just joined the Darlington nurses, and this just shows you how bad things are. This nurse is black, and a patient who was a prisoner, a convicted prisoner, obviously is allowed to have health care and goes into hospital. And this nurse has to listen to this particular patient being incredibly abusive, racist, openly using the N-word, vile, vicious, lashing out. When the nurse on the phone to the doctor described the patient and said the patient went even more ballistic because he identifies as she. Now, all of that is like the madness of 2025. But the real madness is she went home after a bad day at work, right? Bad day at work. And the next morning, she received an email from HR in the hospital suspending her. She was suspended. So she was the victim of racism. She was the victim of aggression at work. But she got into trouble because she misgendered a convicted who was lashing out in a racist fashion and being obnoxious in general.
Yeah.
So much for protecting women at work. So when I think things have improved, anyway, by the way, she's subsequently, wait for it, being sacked. She was moved to another hospital. Then because the case went public, she has been sacked. She's been a nurse for something like 25 years. It was all she ever dreamed of. She worked hard to acquire the qualifications. Now, in the midst of everything, this is where you think, why was that woman, a working class woman, a migrant in this country who had come here and learned her trade, was doing an invaluable job, and all these right-on people who normally shout racism at the drop of a hat, if you use the wrong word, are not defending her. She's not being defended. Her union's not defended her because she misgendered, because it's like a sort of set of rules. And if you breach, and by the way, she didn't even know she was misgendering. She was talking to a doctor. She was talking about the insertion. They needed to do a medical procedure. And the doctor needed to know that this was a male patient because of the type of procedure it was. I won't bore you with it. It was a catheter, I think. So it was something you needed to have the sex-specific biological reality introduced because of medicine. But oh no. So that only happened a few weeks ago, and she has now joined the Darlington Nurses Union. And I do think that whilst I acknowledge that we can talk about it more, or you and I can talk about it and be pretty sure that there will be a huge number of people who will get what we're talking about, and that probably it's less likely to get us into hot water as it would have been even a year or 2 years ago. In certain workplaces, it's still the case that women are trying to negotiate their way around these ridiculous situations. And I find that very depressing. And I'm really disappointed not to see a more proactive attack on this from the Labour government, because the Labour government should have the tradition of fighting for women's equality at work, fighting for women's rights, should recognise what's at stake here. But sadly, they look the other way. They don't want to get embroiled in this because they don't want to fall out with the progressive activist crowd, many of whom have voted for them. But in doing that, they're actually selling out and alienating, I think. Actually, I'd go as far as to say millions of their voters who just assumed they'd be on their side on this one, but now don't trust them on it. Not because they're actively pushing forward trans ideology, but because they won't take seriously the fight that you have to have at work in order to assert your ability as a woman to, as you say, just quite straightforwardly feel safe.
Mm. It's like the top trump card. I was just thinking there. She is black. She is a devout Christian. I've seen the case, and she was under a huge amount of stress doing a medical conversation. And all of that is trumped by a man who is and violent and racist because she, and I use the misgender loosely. And it is, like you said, there's lots of people waking up in those instances that don't seem to hit mainstream news as well, do they? So I think a lot of people still don't see them. Hopefully everybody will listen to this and find out. I think we will have to wrap up, Claire, but what would be your last piece of advice? I'll give you two questions. One is, if you could wave your magic wand now and change something in our culture or our laws, what would that one thing be?
I think laws, I'd get rid of a lot of the speech laws, the malicious communication. I mean, it might sound thing, but I do think that hate crime laws have been a disaster. It's not because I want to encourage hate crimes, but I think the loose definition of what constitutes hate is so subjective that it's just used to silence us. And the threat of being done, and we've seen with the police turning up at the doorstep, threatening you with non-crime hate incidents, and but culture, that's the law. Culturally, I would encourage people. I suppose the thing I would really like is that we become more resilient and that we don't go running off to the authorities at the least hint of an uncomfortable idea. I think we've encouraged the young to act as though they can't cope with words and difficult things they find challenging. But I also think we had that example recently in the WhatsApp group of a parent reporting, somebody in a parent's WhatsApp group reporting another parent because they said the wrong thing about the school and it led to the police turning up and then so on. But you do think, God, I really don't want to live in a society of snitches.
No.
And snitching is based on this idea that there's a whole set of ideas that things you're not allowed to say. And then there's always somebody who's like curtain twitching. But we actually encourage that now. And we say, yes, you have a responsibility to report anything you think is hateful or offensive. And I'm afraid that means that we start to not trust each other. So I'd like to get rid of snitch culture and encourage resilience.
And just finally, what would you say to any woman who wants to speak and hold her boundaries or say what's on her mind? What bit of advice would you give to her?
I'm always a bit anxious about this because I don't want to start saying speak out and be courageous and everybody do that and then they lose their job next week. So I'm aware of the fact that it's not always ideal, but I think that we can at least be courageous in our personal lives. It's not always possible at work. I think, all right, fair enough. It's not always possible to go into work and become a kind of raging, gender critical, I'm going to go in there and argue a sex realist position because HR is standing next to you or the snitch is around the corner. But I think when you're having a drink in the pub or when you're having dinner with people or when you're at the school gates, that we should start saying, what do you think? Because I think it gives people confidence. The other thing is, I do think that without being silly about it, that things like the Academy of Ideas, Battle of Ideas Festival, I think that we need to go to them, go to local discussion groups, start a conversation, because I think the greatest aid to courage is solidarity. Is realizing you're not alone, you're not going mad. That actually, what often happens, by the way, when you say in the pub, by the way, have you heard about that nurse who got that and you tell the story, is everyone goes, it's absolutely bloody ridiculous. But somebody's got to start a conversation. And in my experience, you start the conversation, it's a bit nervous, you're slightly walking on eggshells, and before you know it, there might be one or two people who sit there like frowning and saying, oh my God, bigoted hate speech happening. But actually, the majority of people go, I absolutely agree. It's common sense. We all know what a woman is. We all know what a man is. This is stupid and it's not fair. And it leads to, by the way, what we haven't said and maybe worth saying, young women being affirmed by adults to have double mastectomies
Ugh.
unhealthy bodies is the ideology, which I just think it's worth noting there's a price to pay. It's not just, it's all very well, it's all a bit difficult. In schools, the affirmation of gender ideology is leading young women to want to destroy their own bodies, and in fact, young men, to castrate themselves. We're not talking, and never mind the puberty blockers leading to infertility and all the rest of it. And the governments have now intervened on that after the Cass report. So I think we have an obligation to at least informally start building an atmosphere of public opinion that will mean that whoever is in government, they'll go, God, the public don't like this. And they might do something about it.
Oh, rousing words there to end on, Claire. You're right there. I love that. Thank you so much for all of your time today. I appreciate it so much.
Thank you for asking me such interesting questions and for tolerating me.
Oh, thank you, Claire. Thank you so much for joining me on today's episode. I've had a great time. I hope you've enjoyed it. And again, I would love to hear back from you. So all that leaves me is to say, have fun, be happy, and join me next time. Don't forget to hit subscribe for all of my episodes.